the reason it's called World on the Edge is because it begins to focus on the time that we have or don't have to make the needed adjustments. The basic point is that food, I think, is going to be the weak link in our civilization, as it was for so many earlier civilizations whose archaeological sites we now study, like the Sumerians and the Mayans or the Easter Islanders or what have you.
For the betterment of maybe the earth and not the people, might it be better that, that we really do go through a collapse of sorts and that we rebuild on a local level, because it would have to rebuild on a local level?
Well, what usually happens when a civilization begins to break down under stress is that after a point it can't recover, and everything sort of feeds on everything else. And this is why the Sumerians collapsed and why the Mayans collapsed. But when that happens, there's an enormous dieback. 90+% of populations die. Probably the best place to be in this situation would be on a subsistence farm in a village in sub-Saharan Africa or someplace that's not much affected by what happens to the rest of the world. But I think most people don't realize how vulnerable we are. For example, the food supply in the average city in the United States, if it's not daily renewed, would run out in about 3 days. There's not much of a buffer there.
Did you say 3 days, Lester? I didn't.
3. Yes. So if anything that disrupts that flow of food, I've seen scenarios, someone assumed, what if you have a really virulent strain of flu and the truck drivers don't want to go out and risk bringing it home to their families, so they stay home. They're the ones that get the food into the cities. And so if they're not working, then the system can come apart pretty fast. I just cite that as an example of how vulnerable we are. What I find interesting is that whereas most discussions of the current rise in food prices talk about events that have contributed to this, the heat wave in Russia, flooding in Pakistan or Australia or what have you, and these clearly contribute, but my sense is that what we're looking at is trend-driven rises in food prices. And among those trends are climate change, falling water tables, and thus spreading shortages of irrigation water, soil erosion, and in the more agriculturally advanced countries, a shrinking backlog of unused agricultural technology. And in looking at climate, for example, agriculture as it exists today evolved over an 11,000-year period of rather remarkable climate stability. And what we now have is a system that was designed to maximize production with that climate system. But that climate system is changing. And what we discover now is that there's really no norm to go back to because everything is in flux. The rule of thumb that crop ecologists use for assessing the effect of climate change is that for each 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature during the growing season, we can expect a 10% decline in grain yields, wheat, rice, corn, and so forth. So that's sort of the climate issue. The water issue is in some ways even more imminent because we have identified, the Earth Policy Institute has identified 18 countries that are overpumping their aquifers. And what this means, in effect, is that each of those countries has created a food bubble, a water-based food bubble. They have artificially inflated food production by overpumping, which by definition is a short-term phenomenon. So production keeps going up and up and up with overpumping, and then the aquifer is depleted. At that point, the rate of pumping is necessarily reduced to the rate of recharge. So that's the nature of the food bubble. In some countries it's small, in some countries it's big. The most dramatic example of among the 18 countries of the bubble bursting thus far is in Saudi Arabia. The Saudis decided after the oil export embargo they were vulnerable to a grain export embargo. So using their oil drilling technology, they found an aquifer about a half-mile down that they've been using to produce wheat with irrigation. That worked fine. For more than 20 years, they were self-sufficient in wheat. But in early 2008, they announced that aquifer was largely depleted. That particular aquifer happens to be a fossil aquifer. That is, there's no recharge. And they said they're going to phase out wheat production in 8 years. Well, in fact, it's going much faster than that. And after 3 years, they've lost about 70% of their wheat crop. I mean, wheat production is in collapse, and it will disappear entirely probably in another year or two. What's interesting about this, one, it's so dramatic. And it means the Saudis will be importing all of their wheat, indeed all of their grain, within a year or two. But they can compete in world markets. Syria has also experienced a peak in grain production, begun to decline because of water shortages, and also Iraq. Yemen is a hydrological basket case, and it will shortly experience a dramatic drop in its grain production. It's already importing 80% of its grain. So, but the big water bubbles are in India and China. The World Bank estimates in one of its reports on the water situation in India that 175 million Indians are being fed with grain produced by overpumping. At some point, as aquifers are depleted, that overpumping will disappear, and they'll have to find some other source of food for the 175 million people. Our estimate for China is that 130 million Chinese are being fed by overpumping. So we have these bubbles that are starting to burst. And the interesting thing is that the economists who do agricultural supply and demand projections are hardly even aware of them. When you look at the models they use, they have a lot of economic variables, but no falling water tables, no rising temperatures, for example. And then soil erosion is becoming a major issue, with two massive dust bowls now forming, one in northern and western China and western Mongolia, the other in Central Africa, and it stretches across much of Africa, the whole Sahelian region. Someone said soil erosion is like the tires on your car. After a point, if you keep driving, they wear thin and you have a blowout, then you know you've got a problem. Well, soil erosion is like that. You don't notice it until suddenly you don't have much topsoil left. And there are already countries now where grain production is declining because of soil erosion, like Mongolia, like Lesotho, and North Korea and Haiti are not able to increase their grain supply anymore because of soil erosion. And then the fourth factor that I think is going to make food the focal point of our effort to save civilization is that the more agriculturally advanced countries, Japan, for example, with rice, the Japanese were the pioneers in raising rice yields. They started more than a century ago. But for the last 16 years, their rice yield per acre has not increased at all. It's been flat. China, and it's not because farmers don't want to increase production. They do. They have a support price that's probably 3 times the world market price, or something like that. But there are no new technologies they can use to go beyond where they are. China, rice yields in China are now very close to those in Japan. So China may also be about to plateau, unless it can go above Japan, which I doubt. If that's the case, then we're looking at two countries that produce 1/3 of the world rice harvest, no longer able to increase their production. In Europe, three countries in Europe: France, Germany, and the UK. In all three, wheat yields have plateaued, no longer increasing there. So we have all these trends making it more difficult to expand food production. That's why these price rises now, I think, are disturbing, because it was price rises and a growing number of hungry people that signaled the decline of the Sumerian and the Mayan civilizations.
I find it so interesting, Lester. Reading your book and learning more about you on the internet it's been really sobering for me, because when you talk about, one of the lines that I really liked, and I'm sure I'm not going to have an exact quote here, but it was that failure takes a long time, but collapse comes quickly.
There are many resources that are becoming scarce, but none more so than time. Time, I think, is the critical element in the situation we're in now. And it means not only understanding where we are and what's happening, but in reversing the trends. If we cannot stabilize population, if we cannot stabilize climate, if we cannot stabilize aquifers, we're toast. That's not a debatable point. And I don't think we've yet quite realized how serious the situation is, partly because we're looking at an experience that we've not had before. I mean, if you were to think about failure, and if you're thinking about the potential breakdown of a civilization, you would look first at the weakest parts of the civilization. And those are the failing states. We now have a very substantial list of failing states. And the question becomes, how many failing states before we have a failing global civilization? And so what I recommend as part of Plan B, which is in the new book, World on the Edge, is we have to think about this in wartime terms. We need a mobilization at wartime speed on wartime scale. Just fine-tuning this situation is not going to do it. I noticed President Sarkozy, this year the president of the G20, is concerned about rising food prices. He wants to do something about it. He wants to curb speculation. Well, that's treating the symptom, not the cause of the problem. You get speculation when you have very rapid increases, potentially rapid increases in prices of commodities. But what we need to be looking at is how we can accelerate the shift to smaller families and stabilize population. We need a worldwide effort to raise water productivity, similar to the one we used to raise land, that we launched to raise land productivity a half century ago. But no one is really focused on these causal factors. They're focusing more and more on the symptoms. And with the global environment, as with medicine, treating the symptoms does not cure the problem.
It's not just the environmental system that's broken, it's our political system that is unfortunately broken at the same time when we need them the most.
And it's not always clear to me why climate denial has become such a common thing in a presumably educated society. And I wonder if it might not be part denial, that we don't want to face the complex, demanding situations that we've put ourselves in. If we can deny it, then it's not a problem anymore. And so I have a feeling that's one of the forces at work here. When I think about social change, I sort of have three different models that I find useful. One is the Pearl Harbor model, where you have a catastrophic event that changes everything, literally overnight. The second model is what I call the Berlin Wall model, where you have something building and building and building and building, and finally it just sort of explodes. And the Berlin Wall coming down was the visual manifestation of a political revolution in Eastern Europe. It changed the form of government of every country in the region without bloodshed, with the minor exception of Romania. And we didn't see it coming. I remember the White House called in the head of the agency, and said, how come you guys didn't warn us about this? Not only did our intelligence agencies not warn the White House that this was coming, they didn't anticipate it. And after it happened, they had trouble explaining it. But this is how change comes. This is one of the models of social change. And my own sense is, despite all the problems we have in government, that we may be moving toward a tipping point on the climate issue. And one of the manifestations I see of this is the success of the anti-coal movement in first banning new coal-fired power plants. Banning the construction of new coal-fired power plants. And secondly, now moving into phase 2 to close existing coal-fired power plants and meeting with much more success than most people realize. So that's an example of a story that has not gotten a lot of attention, but that is, I think, an important part of this tipping point phenomenon. My own sense is that coal is basically finished as a source of electricity generation in the United States. It's just a matter of time now until it's phased out. The third model of social change is what I call the sandwich model, where you have an support and support for change and support at the top for that change. And I think to some degree we have that in this country now, though every once in a while you have to wonder.
So I think there are so many details that people, if they haven't read about it or if they haven't been informed, they're under an assumption that's not true, and that is a little rise in temperature isn't going to affect anything.
Well, the interesting thing about the corn plant is that the tassel on the top produces the pollen, and that pollen floats down. And the ear of corn itself, in the early formative stages, has this strands of silk coming out the end. The nuisance part of doing corn on the cob, you have to get rid of all that silk. What most people don't know is that each of those strands of silk is connected to a potential kernel site on the ear, and in order for the kernel to develop, a grain of pollen must fall on that strand of silk, and it's like a fallopian tube, and it carries the pollen to the kernel site. You get fertilization and you get corn. But if you happen to have very hot weather, 95 degrees and above, during that pollination period, the silk dries out, turns brown, and does not work. And so you can get, if you have really high temperatures in that part of July, roughly the first half of July in the Corn Belt, you can do a lot of damage to a corn crop. And one of the examples I use in World on the Edge to give a sense of how close to the edge we are is I look at the Moscow heat wave, where the average temperature in July was 14 degrees Fahrenheit above the norm. This is for the month of July. If someone had told me at this time last year that there would be a heat wave in Russia and the average temperature in July would be 14 degrees above the norm, I would have said, I'm not a climate denier, but that's beyond the pale. We would never see anything as dramatic as that. But in fact, that's what happened. Now, what happened with the Russian grain harvest was they've been hoping for about 100 million tons. Because of that heat and the related drought, it dropped to 60 million tons. So the Russians and the world lost 40 million tons of grain. Okay? If that heat wave had been centered in Chicago, in the heart of the Corn Belt, in a country that produces 400 million tons of grain, then we would have lost, and we had lost 40% of that which could easily happen. Then we would lose 160 million tons of grain, we and the world. If that had happened, world grain stocks would have dropped to the lowest level on record, far below 2 years ago when the food price rise started in late 07 into 08. And we would have seen chaos utter chaos in world grain markets because prices would have gone to levels we cannot even now imagine. And what that would have led to in the first instance would be exporting countries restricting their exports to try and keep their food prices down. And that would limit the amount available. Then we would have seen the oil exporting countries, nearly all of whom import grain, starting to barter oil for grain to make sure they got enough grain for their people. Then the rest of the world, all the other importing countries would have been left out there by themselves with very little grain to compete for. I mention that because that could have led to, one, a total loss of confidence in the market, in the world market, which countries historically have always been able to rely on. I mean, prices might go up a bit, but you could always get the grain you needed. So that loss of faith in the market could lead to a breakdown in the world economy because the whole world economy, the whole monetary system is based on confidence. If you lose confidence, everything begins to come apart. And I use that example just to show how close to the edge we may be. And I don't think we realize it yet. And we don't have indicators of sort of societal stress, if you will, that reflect rising food prices and spreading water shortages and increasing competition by more and more people for limited resources, or competition for oil, for example. I mean, one of the things that I note in World on the Edge is that we may be hitting peak water and peak oil at almost exactly the same time. And you and I have never lived in a world where oil production was declining. It's always been rising. And it's going to be a very different world. Same is true with irrigation water. Throughout our lifetimes, the irrigated area in the world has been expanding. Now suddenly, in some countries, it's starting to shrink, and before long could be shrinking for the world as a whole. So these changes are not always easy for us to anticipate, and experiences we've not had before are not easy to imagine. But this is sort of where we are now, and this is the challenge to kind of go beyond our sort of conventional behavior and begin to try to understand what's happening.
Something else that I read that you wrote was that for every 5 cars we bring online, we pave over an acre of land. Lester, I don't think, of course I knew that there were consequences, but again, I think as people are watching this series, I think they don't, like me, I don't think that they realize the significance of those consequences. An acre for every 5 cars? To me, that's shocking.
You have to keep in mind, I mean, think of a football field as an acre, which it is roughly. And you could put 5 cars, on there and not really occupy that much of it. But you have to have more than one place to park a car if you're going to use it. You have to go at least have one other parking place, and maybe a few of them or several of them with shopping centers and workplaces and so forth. And then you have to have a place to drive it. And when you think about the amount of land you have to pave over, if you can think of looking from the air down at cars on roads and highways and so forth, the cars actually cover only a fairly small part of that space, even when you're, unless you're looking at traffic congestion from the air. So one of the most disturbing trends in the world right now that I see is the extraordinary growth in automobile sales in China. 2 years ago, I think it was 14 million tons. They passed us for the first time. I think it's now 17 million tons and may go up to 20 million tons 20 million cars next year. And the amount of land they're going to have to pave is just extraordinary. I mean, even if they accept more crowding and congestion than we do, they still have to pave more land. And that can become a real threat to their food production. And it is one of the reasons why I think China's going to be turning to the world market for massive quantities of grain in the near future, if not this year, next year, probably. And when it does, it will necessarily come to the United States because we are far and away the world's leading grain exporter. We export probably as much grain as Canada, Australia, and Argentina combined. But what this does is it promises to open a new chapter in our history, because as Americans, cheap food is part of our birthright. We are the world's breadbasket. We only spend 10% of our income on food. But to have 1.4 billion Chinese competing with us for our grain harvest, driving up our food prices, would create an entirely new situation. Now, historically, we had something like that in the 70s with food price inflation after the Soviets cornered the world wheat market because they had a crop failure and people didn't sort of know what was happening. But we banned soybean exports to Japan, for example, totally, because prices are going up so fast here. It would be tempting to do that with China. The only problem is China is our banker now. Every month here in Washington, the U.S. Treasury Department holds an auction selling Treasury securities. And they do this to cover our fiscal deficit because our taxes aren't enough. We're spending far more than we take in government revenue. So the Chinese have been doing this for years now. They now hold almost $1 trillion worth of U.S. Treasury securities. They're our banker. And like it or not, we're going to be sharing our grain harvest with the Chinese, regardless of what happens to our food prices. I think there's a very real possibility that the share of our income spent on food is going to be rising in the years ahead. And one of the reasons will be because of the demands of the Chinese, who are already incidentally importing 80% of their soybeans, much of them from the United States. Partly because of them, we now have more land in soybeans than in wheat, for example, just to show how far that's gone. But when they come for grain, that'll be big time compared with soybeans.
In your book, Lester, that you said countries like China are also, going to other poor countries and renting up all their acreage so that they can feed their own people. So it appears on the backs of other poor people.
In late 2007 and early 2008, when grain and soybean prices tripled, the grain importing countries were having great difficulty finding enough grain to import. There just wasn't enough to go around. And so that was when grain exporting countries like Russia and Argentina for wheat restricted exports to keep their domestic food prices down. And that only made the problem worse, of course, for the rest of the world. Then Vietnam, the world's #2 rice exporter, banned exports entirely for several months because their food prices were getting out of control. And the net effect was that the importing countries lost confidence in the world grain market. So then they tried negotiating long-term grain agreements, and that didn't go very far because it was a seller's market. So exporting countries weren't interested in committing wheat exports for 5 years, for example. So then what they began doing, and Saudi Arabia was one of the first, but joined by China and South Korea and a dozen other countries, including more recently India, they began buying land in other countries on which to produce food for themselves. And that is represents a sort of every country for itself kind of extreme. It begins with exporting countries not willing to share scarcity and restricting their exports. Then it translates into these land grabs. And some of them are huge. I mean, some of China's land acquisitions in Africa, I think one in the Democratic Republic of the Congo is larger than Belgium. I mean, these are not trivial, not a few thousands of acres, but hundreds of thousands and millions of acres. And one of the more interesting developments in this field is that there are a number of countries, including Saudi Arabia, South Korea, and China, that are acquiring land in Ethiopia and the Sudan. which are the upper Nile watershed. And all these land acquisitions also involve water. You don't buy land in that part of the world without getting water to go with it. And so as they develop this, these land grabs, this land to produce food for themselves, it will be with water that will no longer go to Egypt, which is the downstream country in the Nile. And since almost all the water in the Nile is now used, I mean, the Nile is almost dry when it reaches the Mediterranean, any water taken out upstream will not be available to Egypt. So it will be losing irrigation water, and its domestic food production that now accounts for about 45% of its total consumption will get smaller and smaller, making it ever more dependent on the world market. And it already is the world's largest wheat importer. Unless we act quickly, I think civilization itself is at risk. And saving civilization is not a spectator sport. It's not something where we can sit around and hope someone else is going to take care of it. We all have to get involved. And the question I'm asked most frequently when I'm traveling around the world is, people ask, what can I do? And I think they expect me to say, change your light bulbs and recycle your newspapers and so on. Those things are important, but we now have to change the system. We've got to restructure the world economy, and we have to do it quickly. And that restructuring involves backing up fossil fuels and replacing them with renewable sources of energy, with wind and solar and geothermal. And it's now possible. And we have such an abundance of renewable energy. We have 3 states, North Dakota, Kansas, and Texas, that could supply all U.S., from wind alone, could supply all U.S. electricity needs many times over. China has enough harnessable wind energy to increase its current consumption 16-fold if it needed to. That obviously won't happen. There's no need for it. But the point is, we have a lot of, and one could talk about solar in the same terms. We have a lot of renewable energy in the world, and the challenge is to harness it. So as individuals, my challenge is, to get involved. Pick an issue that's important to you.
Please come back and watch complete interviews with each of the experts. And you can join me, Tom Hartman, anytime on the web at tomhartman.com.